housing move-in date. So what is a housing move-in date? Well, a move-in date means a lease arrangement has been made. The client has a key or the ability to enter the unit, and that the client has physically slept in the unit. So if a client moves in on May 13th and they're going to sleep in that unit on May 13th, then their housing move-in date would be May 13th. If a client is ready to move in on May 12th, but does not move in on May 12th, then that is not their move-in date. The move-in date is when they are physically inhabiting the unit. What is, I'm playing geography here with what is the purpose of the housing move-in date? Okay, so the purpose of the housing move-in date, why it's important, is for several reasons. The first one being is that to document the date that a household admitted into a permanent housing project moves into housing. This is critical for the point in time and the hit counts, as well as the APR and the CAPERS, because they do measure the length of time between project start and housing move-in. So it's critical. It differentiates households which have already moved into permanent housing from households which are enrolled in a permanent housing project, but are still literally homeless as they prepare to move into an available unit. So that's the big idea behind housing move-in date, is to be able to separate those that are waiting to be housed from those that are housed. Okay, so as I said before, it's very important for the HIC and PIT counts that these move-in dates are correct and accurate and entered. Because another reason, households which do not have a housing move-in date at the point in time of the report must be excluded from counts of persons in permanent housing. So again, the big idea behind the housing move-in date is to be able to tell apart, to separate the two between those who are enrolled in a project and waiting for housing and those who are housed in the project, as well as to measure that length of time between when a person enters into a project and when a person is housed. So which programs does the housing move-in date apply to? Housing move-in date should be provided for all permanent housing projects and all permanent housing components. So that's a wide spectrum. It's all. This includes permanent supportive housing, housing only, housing with services, and rapid rehousing. When to enter the housing move-in date? The move-in date must be entered if when a household moves into any type of permanent housing, regardless of the funding source or whether the project is providing the rental assistance to differentiate between clients who are housed and those who are experiencing homelessness at different points during the enrollment. So that is from the new 22 data standards. There's not a whole lot of change from the 2020 data standards. It's actually, I think, better written, clearer to understand, and provides more information as you will see later on. But what we're talking about here is that the big takeaway is regardless of funding source, So whether you're COC or ESG or something else, if you have a PH project, then you're going to be needing to enter a housing move-in date. And also to, when you look at it, again, you know, the big picture, you're separating out those who are housed from those who are not housed. And you're looking at that length of time between when a person started your project and when they were put into a unit. As we move on, we'll dive a little deeper into that. Okay, so rapid fire time. We're going to do a couple of quick questions. What's it called? It's called the housing move-in date. That's what you'll see in Client Track. The date the client moved into permanent housing. Who's it collected on? It's collected on the heads of household. So if you have a household with 5 members, there's only one head of household, and that is the person that you will record the housing move-in date on. Can you have more than one housing move-in date per enrollment? No, you cannot have more than one housing move-in date per enrollment. Can you have more than one housing move-in date per client? Yes, you can have more than one housing move-in date per client. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but basically, you're going to need to exit the client and then re-enroll them in certain cases where the situation has changed. And we'll cover that a little more later. But for now, the important takeaway is who's it collected on? The heads of household. More than one housing move-in date per enrollment? No. More than one housing move-in date per client? Yes. Okay. And the housing move-in date must be a date occurring either on or between the project start date and the project exit date. It may be the same date as the project start date if the client moves into housing on the date they were accepted into the program. So somebody comes in on May 13th and they slide right on into a unit and sleep there on May 13th, then the project start date and the housing move-in date would be the same. If they come in on May 13th and they slide into a unit on May 14th and sleep in the unit on May 14th, then the project start date would be May 13th and the housing move-in date would be May 14th. Once a housing move-in date has been recorded for an enrollment, it should not be removed from the client's record, even if they subsequently lose that housing situation. Users must only edit data to correct errors. So again, this goes back to one housing move-in date per enrollment. So if they were to lose their unit for whatever reason, then you would exit them out and re-enroll them. And again, HUD is saying here, users must only edit data to correct errors. Okay, so where in HMIS is the housing move-in date located? Great question. The housing move-in date can be found on the program enrollment section of the standard program enrollment. Specifically, is located on the far right of the head of households subject line. So you will see here, took a screenshot. This is in training. None of this is personal identifying information. This is a totally fictional client. But as you can see, the top line here is the head of households line, and housing move-in date is right next to relationship of head of household. And you see here in the intake, you do basic client information, family members, and then you come to program enrollment. So further up on the page, you would select the program and then you would scroll down and select the family members for that program. I added a son here, and as you can see that the child does not have use the housing move-in date. It is only for the head of household. HUD provided a couple of different scenarios that are different than the ones they provided in the 2020 standards. So in this first scenario, in the event a client vacates a housing situation and the project stops paying rental assistance, staff should exit the client from the project with an accurate project date, exit, and destination, create a new project start date and a second enrollment of the client on the same or following day. When a new unit is found, a new housing move-in date will be recorded on the second project record. So the first scenario, we have a client who has vacated the housing for whatever reason, and the project has stopped paying the rental assistance. So then you would exit the client, provide the exit destination, but continue to work with the client to find them housing. So you would then re-enroll them in the program. And then when another unit was found that was suitable for them, you would follow the same procedure and enter the housing move-in date the first day that they sleep in the new place. And again, this is to differentiate between who is housed and who is not housed, and the length of time between when the project starts and when they're moved in. The next scenario that HUD provided for us was if a client moves directly from one unit into another unit with no days of homelessness in between, it would not be necessary to exit and re-enter them because their housing move-in date would still be accurately reflecting the day they entered permanent housing according to that enrollment record. Okay, so in this situation, we have a client who is moving from one unit to another with no breaks in between. So for example, say their apartment was flooded. I know back in my 20s, I lived in quite a few apartments that got flooded for a variety of reasons. Rain, upstairs washing machine, my washing machine, floods were just happening all the time. So, in that situation where they're moving from one unit to another and there's no break in continuity. There's no days of homelessness in between, then it is not necessary to exit and re-enter them because their housing move-in date hasn't actually changed in the eyes of HUD, and that it would still be accurate. So kind of particular there, an important thing to remember is if there's a break between housing, you're going to want to exit and re-enroll. If there's no break, then you can continue on with the original move-in date. And then HUD provided us with a third scenario, which is if a client is transferred into a PSH or RRH project, having already moved in, the client's project start date and housing move-in date will be the same. So this is interesting, and the way that I read it is that if a client is being transferred into your PSH or RRH program and they are already housed, then their project start date into your project and their housing move-in date are the same. So the day they come into your project is their housing move-in date, even if they're already housed. Okay, so before we move on to correcting the housing move-in date, in the 2020 data standards, HUD did mention a fourth scenario, and that is not in the 2022 standards. So it leads me to believe that it's not all that common. However, they did say that this is for rapid rehousing only. Only if you have a rapid rehousing project. If your rapid rehousing project is providing supportive services, then you still have to enter a housing move-in date for that client. So even if you're rapid rehousing, and this is rapid rehousing only, even if your rapid rehousing is not paying the rental assistance, but you are offering the supportive services for the client, then you need to enter a housing move-in date for that client, which I don't think happens all that often because they left it out of the 2022 data standards. They didn't even put it in there. So that pretty much is what the housing move-in date is all about from HUD's point of view. Moving on to correcting the housing move-in date. It's pretty standard as you would make any other correction in the workflow. To correct the housing move-in date, go to the client's dashboard. Next to the client's enrollment is a blue action button. If anybody here was old enough to be around in the 80s, it looks like a play button on the old, what they used to call boom boxes or tape recorders. You would have a play button. That's what it looks like. It's a blue action button. And you click on it, it's going to open up the sub menu. And when it opens up that sub menu, there's going to be a variety of choices, and those choices will vary program to program. But in this particular instance, you're going to want to select the Edit Project Entry Workflow. And that is the best way to make any type of correction for clients, is to do it through the workflow. For one thing, that ensures that it stays connected to the client, which is very important. So Edit Project Entry Workflow, and then you go through the enrollment until you get to the program enrollment section. When you get to the program enrollment section, you can then change the move-in date. Again, it's on the Head of Households line over at the far right. And then you can enter the housing move-in date there. Cannot be before the project start date. And then remember to save the change. So that's really important. If you go and you edit everything correctly, but you don't save it, you just exit out of the workflow or just sign off of HMIS, that is not going to be reflected. So really important that when you go in and make these changes, to save them. And then before you get out of the workflow. Okay, so thank you for coming today, and we're going to open it up for some conversation on the housing move-in date. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.